very interesting in the student protest against the Tory headquarters for November 11th, 2010, is how an event like this conflicts between a set of fantasy coordinates that political parties in the West generally develop and suddenly a moment of reality. And I quote Yeats in his poem on Spring 1916 on the Irish Uprising, which at first didn't have public support, but somehow manages to turn the Irish public against the principle that they were part of Britain. And he said that a terrible beauty is born. What we have emerging in the right wing of the West, and it's probably been carried out to the largest extent by the Tory party in Britain, is a fantasy arrangement that has been existing in the West a long time, that somehow government spending was completely out of hand and needed to be scaled back. And this is a party line all over Western governments, very prominent in the United States, that a scale back of the size of government will increase liberty. Okay, and it's a fantasy position. I mean, it doesn't really exist. There's no point where you can say, well, you know, there's a society where the government utterly collapsed and liberty was preserved. But it's a delusional dream that, particularly for an older population, an authoritarian population, clings to. What we see in London is suddenly students realizing that they're going to be £40,000 in debt. The majority of students, I understand, are going to be coming out of university with £40,000 worth of debt. Now, in current American dollars, it's almost like $70,000, $60,000 or $70,000 in debt coming out of university. It's the cost of a very, very high-end sports car automobile. And for students who are studying law or medicine, probably not an issue. Large numbers of student populations aren't seeking economic benefits. They are interested in the subject and they'd like to work in teaching or other kinds of social work, or they'd like to make a living. Well, they're going to be coming out of university right now saddled with £40,000 in debt. They seem to have been targeted by the government as the victims. They've been targeted as the other. They don't basically support the Tory party. They're not basically part of the Tory party. And they've been signaled out as the bearers of a kind of a negative cost, a punishment, a collective guilt that has to be imposed on the British people for a hallucinatory, excessive public spending and a great wealth of public spending. In the smashing of the glass, in the fact that so many students came and protested, and you also see it's almost in the impotency of the police to even take any type of reaction, the absolute impotency of the society to suddenly respond to the fact that this party was being attacked like this. You see what happens when a political system which is governed by a coordinate set of fantasies, authoritarian fantasies that see all of the transformations that have happened in the 20th century towards workers' rights, students' rights, promoting opportunities, promoting equality, is actually having diminished liberty, conflicting with a very real reality. And that becomes an extremely dangerous system. Because the problem is the people in power continue to live in their fantasy. And when individuals who are exposed to the more brutal reality of that fantasy suddenly emerge, the fantasy system is desperate to try to understand or re-hallucinate what's going on. We already see this in the conservative press. It's a few handful of hooligan anarchists. Personally, if I was a university student in the United Kingdom and I was studying, say, French or English, and my goals were to be an academic or a teacher or something like that, and I was informed that upon graduation, because I was middle class, I was going to walk out of there with £40,000 in debt before I've even gotten my first job, I would be upset. This is a real anger, a real frustration that we see playing out here. And we're seeing it playing out. There's more strikes in the UK, there's more upset. And this is where societies potentially can become destabilized. Because what you get is you get power, which is clinging on to a system or structure of fantasy, confronting the real implications of what they do. Generally, these conservative governments have always had the sense to go at the most disenfranchised parts and disparate parts of the community. Poor people who are living in public housing, they're scattered throughout the country, they're disorganized, they're just basically trying to make a living. They're a very easy victim to target. But for some reason that the fantasy was carried out to the extent to which middle class, working class university students have now become the major bearers of this imagined guilt that the British people, not the banking structures, not the people who caused this problem by crazy investments or running their businesses like casinos, but the ideal that there's a guilt debt that has to be repaid, a repayment in suffering that must be inflicted on most of the people. This is the fantasy in which the Tory party is being driven right now. What we saw is that fantasy collapsing in the face of the reality of people, students, who are going to have to pay £40,000 a year when they get out. And this is not simply going to go away by claiming it's a few hooligans or hire police or anything like this. The reality, the simple reality is that the Tory parties and the Lib Dems going along with this, their change in fees to university going to greatly impoverish a large number of the people who would normally be middle class. And this is incredibly instabilizing when you start to target an academic middle class group. They're the ones who generally are the bearers of, I don't want to quote, say revolutionary change. I doubt there'll be revolutionary change, but they're usually the ones who get out in the street and make it impossible to believe the hallucination anymore. I mean, they've done this definitely in Iran, even though the government preserved. It doesn't mean that the government is going to collapse. What it does mean is it means the fantasy that that this political party is holding about a collective guilt that the economic crisis is because people were getting too much and weren't paying their ways has gone for a large percentage of people. And I suspect that out of this, for a large part of the British population, that fantasy is now gone. I think a lot of people could see themselves in that situation. People who attended university can imagine what it would be like for 40,000, and suddenly sort of images or visions, hallucinations of an underclass who's living off the dole and getting privilege and getting all of that evaporates. And it's suddenly clear that in a country that's involved in the war in Afghanistan, that's rebuilding the Trident system, that to get a university education is going to leave you with a debt that's going to follow you through decades. It's going to prevent you potentially from buying your first house for years. That you're going to have to, I mean, a married couple who both went to university are going to be saddled with £80,000 worth of debt potentially. This is reality. And what happens always when a political system pushes itself too much to a fantasy explanation, where it denies the objective coordinates of what is happening and accepts a kind of fantasy, is that it creates victims. And if it creates the wrong kind of victims, particularly if it creates middle class or educated victims, it sees this kind of violence.